No, and also those budgets have been cut a lot in the past 13 years. I mean, the spend on capital, so that's the buildings themselves across the school estate, is about 50% lower over the past 13 years. And heads have repeatedly said that the more that you cut our budgets, the less likely we are to be able to maintain our ceilings, our walls, and now those are the exact parts of the buildings which they're starting to worry about.
How have we got to this point, Laura? I mean, we've known about this crumbling concrete. There's been warnings about it for over 30 years. How has it come to the end of this 6-week holiday and parents still aren't sure if the school that they're sending their children to is a safe building?
I mean, I think there's a long-term and a short-term answer to that. The long-term answer is that in the mid-90s, it was clear that there was going to be about 14,000 schools in this position. And so the Labour government in the late 90s and the 2000s spent a lot of money. It had this huge list of schools, and it was essentially going through and rebuilding them one after the other. In 2010, David Cameron, then the Prime Minister, decided that what he was going to do was stop that programme and severely limit it. And of course, the plan was austerity would mean that by now there'd be lots more money. Unfortunately, there isn't any money and the roofs are caving in. And so this is the situation we find ourselves in. Why it's taken until now, I'm not entirely clear, and I don't think we'll find out for a little while, but I suspect that there has been new information over the summer, or more alarming information, which means that they want to raise the concern levels on these particular 150 schools for now. And no one wants to be in the position, of course, where they would have to sit on television and explain why this has happened. So I think they are being cautious, and that's a very good thing. It's just a shame it's come so late.
There's a few of them that are going to be on television today, Laura, having to explain that very thing, and none of it seems to ring true. They did know about it, and they chose not to investigate it and spend on it, and now they're pretending that children's safety is priority.
That's right. And I think it's a shame that we're in a situation where the Chancellor is pretending that there is going to be extra cash for this when there isn't. I mean, I think it's one thing to be honest in a dreadful situation we shouldn't be in, but I think to be dishonest, or at least misleading at best in these situations, is really going to upset the teachers. And bear in mind, this isn't just as well about the concrete in this particular circumstance. We know from TeachTap, we survey 10,000 teachers each day. Around 40% of schools say that they've got a bucket somewhere in their school because there's a leaking roof. It's also about the fact that we think 12% of teachers are saying there's at least one room in their school they already can't use because of the lack of maintenance. And safety is the number one concern. That's the absolute worst part of this and has to be dealt with first. But also, who wants to be sending their children to schools where there are leaking roofs? This is something that does need investment for the long term, because it's investment in children's futures. And that's what we hear teachers saying constantly.
Well, this is the issue, isn't it? And it is a much wider one than just the concrete. I mean, in some of the papers this morning, it's remarking that official figures from the Department of Education 2019 says asbestos is present in England schools, 4 out of 5 schools. So it just makes you think, doesn't it? If you're looking at the concrete, if that work's being done, well, we could have a real big asbestos issue as well. This could take months to fix.
That's right. And there are claims every year for compensation on schools because of the fact that there are people who end up with mesothelioma, which is the cancer related to asbestos, in schools because they happen to be somewhere where it gets disturbed, whether that's a kid kicking a football into one of the ceiling panels and then the next thing you know, it falls down. This is something we reported on when I was the editor of Schools Week back in 2016, 2017. And as you say, we're now many years further forwards. Of course, there's been a pandemic in the middle, but we can't get away from the fact that there are some big issues with school buildings that have been going for some time. And had we continued that programme of rebuilding, there would be fewer of them. Not saying there wouldn't be any, but there'd be fewer. And unfortunately, now we're in a circumstance where this is going to have to be dealt with quickly, which means it's going to be more expensive. And there's less cash in the bank than it was in the past. So for me, this is going to end up a bit like the cladding scandal, where there's going to be lots of finger pointing, the local authorities, the schools themselves, the government, and everyone is going to have to work together very quickly to figure out how this cash is going to be put in, because the schools' budgets are not in a space where they're able to cover this, despite what the Chancellor is saying.
Absolutely, Laura. Absolutely. The country's broke. There's nothing in the cupboard, nothing anywhere. There's nothing for the doctors, the nurses, the train drivers. We could go on and on and on. There's nothing for anybody, least of all schools. but there is a massive foreign aid budget. Surely we've got to get to a stage where someone says, look after your own first.
I think there's always complicated issues around this. And one of the things with the foreign aid is that in the end, if we don't spend money on foreign aid, then you actually end up having to intervene again later down the line. So you'll often see, a bit like with the school building issue, it's very easy to say, let's cut that now. But in 10 years' time, if we don't have investment in foreign countries or there hasn't been support and help, you can end up with worse situations in those countries 10 years down the line that ends up costing the country even more. I do think what would be good is if we had on both sides of the political agenda, people trying to work out where we could do innovative things. Now, there's a lot of criticism for it. And in the past, perhaps it wasn't done perfectly. But in the late 90s, Gordon Brown did look at the private finance initiatives for schools. That was a way of getting businesses to help fund school buildings. They weren't perfectly set up and there have been some issues, but there's got to be more innovative ways. What we don't really hear at the moment is politicians coming up with new ideas. It's often very, very basic. They're just saying they're not going to do anything, or we're trying to cut and pinch around the side. We've got to think about how we raise more cash.